thank you to Phil and to Eve and the department for inviting me. It's really lovely to be here in this inaugural moment this year, relaunching the Global Studies programs here. I feel very honored to be here, not least because of all that Eve and Phil and new faculty here have accomplished in an incredibly short amount of time to transform the program and take it into the future, but also because Eve and Phil were not just my colleagues, but the ones that brought me to UCSB. Eve hired me when she was chair there, and her imprint is not just in the way that I think about my work in relationship to global studies as a geographer, but also I think in the imprint of the leadership of this department, young in its remaking though it may be, in shaping where all global studies can think about and aspire to in terms of an intellectual rigor, critical stance, real engagement, and I would think really, I think in a very broad way, an orientation that is something that can be transplanted into other fields and other interdisciplinary engagements. And so here, I apologize to Phil for changing the title of my talk, Subtle Difference, but I broadened it before I kind of narrowed it around manufacturing energy to make it a little bit more legible, but with your training here, I know you can pick up on these more varied kinds of engagements and valences in the language here. And here I'd like to point out just two points of kind of conceptual and global studies framing vis-a-vis the idea of politics and of value. That from a global studies perspective, I would argue that you cannot understand the global without grounding it in the local. And that the connection between politics as social processes, contestation, power, structuration, but also about cultural meaning of those things, right? That the work that Phil and Eve have modeled in their textbooks on global studies point to this, that you cannot understand something like politics without the nuances of engagements with other fields, like, for instance, anthropology or the humanities, in looking at the effective dimensions of how people understand what is shaping their lives, and then how those understandings go on to shape what we call structure, right? That it's much more nuanced, and that the global is in no way uniform, right? The global is about interlinkage, relationships, inequalities, unevenness, more than it is about anything that is universal. And so here, the word value is really important to take not for granted, right? That in a phrase like this, we might think about easily fungible or exchangeable, commodified things that have a kind of universal understanding, that we understand a unit of low carbon commodified value as something that is objectively, or at least in a market, has an objective truth, as something that is stable and can be referenced. But what I want to call attention to are the processes in which low carbon value and renewable energy commodities are actually produced in the world, and what that means about how we understand energy itself and energy resources, but then also the remaking of those things in the face of global climate change and trying to mitigate it. Just a quick poll, let's get a quick poll about, or can I get anybody to guess, what is the global share of renewable energy that is by generation or consumption in the world? Anyone? For renewable energy, broadly conceived. Stuff that can kind of be replenished on a human timescale. So including, say, like burning wood or other kinds of biomass, solar, hydro, wind and solar. Anyone? Yeah. 20%? That's a good guess. Anyone else? In that neighborhood. Like, so if we include everything that's like, including things that can be quite destructive, but are technically in some sense So deforestation, for instance, if we count cutting down forests to burn for direct fuel, or making charcoal, we can get up around close to 30%. If we eliminate that stuff and just have large hydro, maybe we get down to upper teens, 17, 18%. What about just wind and solar? And solar for electricity, not for heat. Anyone? Want to venture a guess? 7? That's good. You guys are very well informed. I'm impressed. And so, but for really wind and solar globally, so 7 would be, we're approaching that in Europe and in as an aggregate in the United States. Developed economies is getting up towards that. But actually, globally, it's under 2% for just wind and solar. Solar, in the neighborhood of less than 1%. And so, if I say that, how does that meet your expectations? Anyone? Is that like high or low? Or about what you think? Low, right? And so, I think a part of that story is how we think about the role of energy and what energy transition means, right? Just this notion that about share is about an idea of just transforming those relative numbers, right? The zero sum, moving renewables from 1 to 2 to 3 means moving non-renewables, right, from 98, 97, 96, and so on, right? Absolute progress. Unilinear kind of change in history and what we do, but without changing anything else. And that's something I want to struggle with as we go through what it means to have a renewable resource and what it means to think about a global condition of climate change and the atmosphere as something that is both geophysical, but then also social, right, in all its dimensions, political, cultural, and so on. So the materiality of resources, energy resources, really matters, right? So materiality and matter. Thinking about the play on those words is actually being very significant, right? The way that things matter, the way that they are solid to us, the way that we understand them is not something that is necessarily pre-given by its actual nature as a thing, but is shaped by how that thing relates to social systems and what we do with it. What we might think of as the overall kind of assemblages of industrial, infrastructural, labor relations processes, and so on that enable something like primary energy resources, something like coal in the ground, to become something that is an industrialized product that can go into a power plant, one of which is pictured here in the background. This is the top of a coal thermal plant here. And I'll call attention to some other aspects here and through the images. I do a lot of visual ethnography, and the way that people perceive their landscapes and their surroundings and their changes is something that I draw upon to highlight how actual broader social and environmental changes are understood by the people that inhabit them and make them possible, but also people who are subject to the changes with less political agency. So I'm trying to weave together a few different things. One is just the stories that occur in my case study, which is in China, and is a single case. But at the same time, what I argue is, of course, a global process. And so I hope to kind of demonstrate the value of global studies and to have a global studies in action kind of approach to unpacking what I'm talking about at the same time that I'm trying to deliver some of the material. And so please try to keep that in mind. And then I'm happy to take questions on both this kind of like my global studies approach, as well as the material itself and the stories that are contained here. And so materiality of energy resources matters. Their geographies are shaped by uneven political economies and power and so on. And these assemblages of social and physical and cultural infrastructures enable people to make primary energy, something like coal in the ground or sunlight shining down onto the surface of the Earth into what Julian Simon referred to as the master resource. He meant this as a signifier of limitless potential that, quote, enables us to convert one material to another, end quote. However, I argue that this kind of view of energy belies and is actually predicated upon relationships to energy that are shaped in the 20th century around fossil fuels and primarily oil. That is to say, our understanding of what energy ought to be is fundamentally based on fossil fuel use and its role in capitalist modernization. And so the relationships, so thus the idea of a master resource is not just this one of limitless potential, it's something that is taken in hand by humans to realize human potential, but really we ought to take into real serious consideration this idea of the master and the resource. That is global histories and geographies of enslavement and colonialism, of domination and control, of difference, of making difference and making difference matter to governance and to how resources are defined, extracted, and benefited from, of differential forms of value and how we understand the kind of values that matter, right? What makes certain kinds of politics justifiable, legible, and how those things dovetail with forms of domination and then also consent at the same time. That is to say, not just an actual active kind of participation and consent in shaping and taking part in how these kinds of energy resources are used. And so material characteristics of energy shape consumption in our myriad cultural dimensions of resource mattering, of use value, right? So being able to turn on the lights and to have the coal plant be invisible and to not be something we have to think about, right? That encapsulates some of this kind of approach to how we understand what energy is supposed to do and what that relationship between a ratio of a global energy mix, right, and renewables number as just this absolute relationship and exchangeability with fossil fuels, what that actually then comes to mean. All right, that's a lot in just the framing, but are people with me so far? Any questions? Welcome any interruptions. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. And so the point here, I argue, is that low carbon value is not to be taken as the material and political economic other of fossil fuels and fossil fuels driven modernity. That defined as the measurable climate change mitigation impact upon the atmosphere and upon climate change driving greenhouse gases, low carbon value requires cultural forms that represent this kind of subtractive value, right, that ratio, as being really self-evident, right? That if you replace 1 unit of energy from a so-called renewable resource, then that means you've done something not just to mitigate fossil fuel use, but that you've actually made a direct connection between turning on the light with solar power, wind power, for instance, and the actual atmosphere. There's a massive chain of events, vast geographies of landscapes, political economies, people's labor, and so on that make that imagination possible. And so let's take one case of that, and that is the construction of the solar PV industry in China over a very short period between around 2005, when China had about less than 5% of global manufacturing capacity, to 2015, when it had over 70% of global manufacturing capacity, so in a decade. And so here, I invite you to start to look at some of the landscapes that were in transition when I was doing my primary field work in Jia-Ching, which is a small, in Chinese terms, a small city in Jiangsu province of around 1.2 million people, but over a vast area of about 2,000 square kilometers. And here, if you look in this image, you'll see a few things that are quite striking right away. There's these ducks. Does anybody have any idea what these things are? Anyone from China or elsewhere seen this kind of thing? These are power plant waste heat ducts. And so you see these in some places in China where they're actually utilized to do district heating. That is to like take the waste heat from electricity production in this coal thermal power plant in the back, and to channel it into other uses such as heating homes in cold places. But these are here industrial infrastructure to use the heat to drive boilers and do other things for manufacturing. At the same time, you'll see that they look defunct, right? And in fact, they are, and they were never utilized. And here I just want to point out some of the tensions around the rapid construction of capacity. So all of this land here had previously been held by a single village, and it was displaced to build a part of an industrial park. And so the land had previously been highly fertile. Here you see these kind of undulating surface here, and that is due to under these weeds are actually the rubble of demolished homes. And this is a process in change. This is a process in flux, right? This is not the final dispensation of this land or this place, but it does highlight the fact that our kind of imagination of development in China as something that's almost instantaneous, right? This narrative of urbanization and development is happening by government fiat and essentially overnight, and generating social change and consent just by fiat, right? By a government edict, this notion of total kind of state-led development. However, these images point to larger processes, slower processes of change, and unevenness. And so a couple of things that I want to point out vis-a-vis the stories that I want to tell right now are that this is some of the most fertile. Here you can see some kind of flooded areas here. This is in the mid-ground. That's actually what used to be a rice paddy. It's among the most fertile rice agricultural land in the entire country. And yet it's being, and by law, it's supposed to be protected. But in fact, the fact that it's being enclosed for renewables industry development enables an easy kind of bypass of those regulations and state kind of permission from higher levels of government to the local government to enclose that land and transform its use classifications for government joint ventures around the solar industry. We'll move forward. And so here, I just want to make visible some of the kind of connections between what was in the background and the foreground and the transformations over time that take place in these landscapes. This takes us to the site of a construction, state-led construction of a solar development zone in outside of Hangzhou, also in Jiangsu province, and the creation of over 500, 15 hectares, approximately quarter of a square kilometer. This was 7 city blocks, essentially, of New York City blocks of solar factories that were built over 2 years. And here what you see pictured is on the right, a colleague of mine from a US solar venture that actually recently, a couple of years ago, went bankrupt, but had been one of the largest installers in the country. And its kind of trajectories were directly entangled with the role of China's solar in shaping the green energy economies in the US and Europe, but then also the kinds of ways that China's industrial policy then affect global markets, something that is hotly debated in the Trump presidency. And so here what you see pictured is actually a group of 60 young people who are all just immediate graduates from college. They were recruited from a nearby city directly by the Economic Development Zone administration in order to staff these new solar companies and this one in particular, but under the kind of direct employment and labor management led by the state. That is to say, they were actually working for these private enterprises, but these private enterprises were in a phase of being shepherded and actually state-controlled until they reach profitability. And so we can think about this as a particular model of creating business that's driven by foreign-owned expertise and foreign-trained expertise and foreign-owned capital in its collaborations with local state actors. And this is a kind of modularity, a kind of model that was used across the southern Yangtze Delta region to build the solar industry. And the most famous company to come out of this was called Suntech, which up until 2013, when it went bankrupt, was the world's largest producer of solar, and its CEO was the richest man in China for about 2.5 years, Shi Zhengrong. And so this company, which I'll call Qi Solar, had its IPO in 2007 or 8 on the NASDAQ, and raised hundreds of millions of foreign capital, but then also received reciprocal kind of incentives through the direct earmarking of targets for purchasing and installation of solar panels by different governments around the country through incentives, right? So the lowering of prices of solar panels by the unit energy they produce as a direct subsidy by the government that was negotiated with different places where they're going to be installed. And then also the company was given special incentives because the CEO was trained with a PhD in solar PV technology by a foreign university. And so the foreign university being the University of New South Wales, which was a major hub for the transfer of solar expertise to China. And so the University of New South Wales also developed models for manufacturing as well as for doing ongoing R&D to improve efficiencies in the panels themselves. And this was all directly imported to China as these kinds of knowledge transfer systems that allowed university professors in New South Wales to create partnerships with their Chinese citizen students to create entrepreneurship models, right? And things that would scale very easily and with little other foreign expertise, right? That with the basic understanding of manufacturing gained at University of New South Wales, a single individual could plan and scale a massive set of joint ventures with a local government, going to any kind of size that capital investment, for any amount of capital investment that you could gain, you could build a solar factory to profitability, right? With this kind of modular approach in which land, physical plant, even labor recruitment and retention and management were undertaken by the state until companies kind of got stable. So think about that. This is a collaboration between global capital in private investment that then is assured by the Chinese state itself and drives the massive kind of rise in absolute production of solar panels, but then also in economic value of the solar industry itself. This is the capitalization of Qi Solar here after its IPO. And so this modular approach enabled over just a decade the proliferation of development zones that included economic development zones that included some earmarks and government-approved incentives for renewables and renewable energy. This is not just for solar, but for a wide range of what are in China called new energy industries, and that also includes carbon capture. It includes research and development. It includes thermal power, it includes nuclear and hydro, everything except for essentially coal. And it does also, in some places, refer to natural gas, depending on kind of infrastructure construction. And so there's over 200 zones that were built over just a decade that include these kinds of modular approaches to shepherding the renewables and industries. And that is, I hope we understand now, is a part of a global process that happens to be sited in China and leverages forms of politics and regulation and development that are distinctly Chinese at the same time that we can't distinguish them as just being Chinese at the same time, right? And so this is China's first national state designated low carbon development zone. And it was designated as such for its construction of what had been at the time China's leading and largest solar panel manufacturer. By 2015, or what year, I'm sorry. I think maybe even by 2012 or 13 or so, Baoding had become China's most air polluted city. And so here we have this kind of disjuncture between what it means to be low carbon, but then as something in terms of an industrial output versus what has to drive that. And here in Baoding and in Jia-Ching in the first slide, we know that that is predominantly dirty coal power, the kinds of coal that drive terrible air pollution and ill health in Chinese cities, and indeed, of course, cities around the world. In Jiangsu, Baoding is not in Jiangsu, but in Jiangsu, where two new coal plants had to be built in order to support the industrialization around new green industries, it was estimated that in 2017, over 1 million people across the province died to some degree of premature pollution-related illnesses. This is a series of adjacent 15-hectare land plots that were earmarked for essentially identical, modular, state-run enterprises that are majority held by private capital, but are shepherded and constructed by the Jia-Ching government. These three projects together brought 500 megawatts of manufacturing capacity and over $150 million of foreign investment between 2010 and 2012, when all plants had been completed. But by 2012, by the end of 2012, at the turn of 2013, the price of solar commodities dropped by over 34%, several times over the predicted 7% decrease that had been historically averaged. And of course, this is due to a crisis of oversupply and overcapacity as these projects were being built. And more land across southeastern China was being enclosed into these green development zones, and indeed also in the central and northwestern parts of China as well, as the earlier map showed. And so these projects are highly speculative, right? This land is enclosed for was enclosed for a larger industrial ecology analyzed development of the solar industry. What that meant was that materials and industrial process engineers came together to analyze what the bottlenecks and the potential economic opportunities in the solar industry were, and to try to plan for the creation of those industries in proximity to one another so that they could generate economic growth. And so what was analyzed then was an idea about how much solar manufacturing could be sustained by the local labor market, but then also just by foreign investment that could be generated, and by PhDs, Chinese PhDs that could qualify for state earmarks of installation and subsidies, and grants for enterprise incubation. And so this is speculative not just on markets, but also on politics and the positions of those that are involved, right? And in Chinese cities, and indeed across its entire the party state structure, political promotion runs on particular cycles and with particular metrics. And so what I found was that these moments of speculation where a large plan for the solar industry, for instance, would take place, wouldn't necessarily come to fruition because cadre might be promoted for their previous successes. And so that's what happened in Jia-Ching. This economic development zone was so successful in its first phases that they lost their political leadership. They were promoted to elsewhere. And that led to, for years, this condition where fields had been fallowed for the purpose of creating solar industry, but there was no investment. A couple years ago, the largest solar company in the US joined a partnership with Jia-Ching-based companies to raise funds for the world's largest solar manufacturing, single-site solar manufacturing plant of over 5 gigawatts. The largest in the United States is famously constructed by Tesla in Buffalo, New York, to have 1.2 gigawatts of capacity, and that single factory building is 1.2 million square feet. It's 1/5 the size in manufacturing capacity is what's proposed by Solar Fund and its partners in Jia-Ching. And still that project hasn't broken ground, but the land has been granted to them to try. That's quite meaningful in terms of what the state is willing to do, right, in leading the solar industry, but then also, as we'll see, in terms of its impact, both environmentally, but then also on a global green economy. And so this is highly speculative in multiple dimensions. A part of that speculation is the construction of infrastructure that can be put to use, right, to matter in a new way, right? So the development of new generation coal thermal plants to drive green industrialization. Of course, this, in a sense, removes a high amount of, it means that every solar panel produced in this zone has a larger carbon footprint than, say, solar panels that might be built in Europe, Japan, or the United States, or Korea, the other major manufacturing hubs, although, of course, dwarfed by China's capacity. And so, as I mentioned before, this kind of expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure, the high carbon kind of foundation for low carbon value, is also one that is written into people's bodies by the emissions from these plants. The expansion of premature lost healthy life years was estimated in just Jiangsu province by the Global Burden of Disease Study in 2010 to be 1.2 million life years lost. By 2017, that number has doubled. This kind of premature exposure to loss of life, to ill health, is something that we might think about, although China is often talked about as a post-racial society or thought of as being ethnically diverse, but at the same time ethnically dominated by Han Chinese, that in fact among supposedly ethnically homogenous communities, such as those in Southeast China, where almost the entire population is Han Chinese, there is an incredible segmentation and identification of people from where they come, right? Related to primarily the kind of urban and rural divide, which many of you, I'm sure, have heard about, which existed historically in China to maintain people in the places, not just where they were born, but where their parents were born. And so to separate rural inhabitants from urban ones, and to maintain rural production around agriculture to drive surplus production for industrialization. In today's China, where there's master planned massive movements of hundreds of millions of people from villages into peri-urban, that is on the edge of cities, new towns, and places like these new industrial clusters, generations of people who've undergone social and environmental transformation and engagement with the socialist project now find themselves as being unemployable and indeed a certain kind of population problem for the state. The demolition, wholesale demolition of rural landscapes and their transformation into resources, right, into land resources rather than kind of places of community. Whereas during the revolution and through the 80s, villages were understood to be cohesive kinds of connections between what was called the three agrarian problems, right? Of agrarian society, agrarian production, and agrarian places. So a way in which a village represented social bonds, a particular relationship to the state, and a particular relationship to society and production, right? That it was legible. Like if you were a villager, you had these kinds of relationships. But now, village land itself is thought of as something that is a national environmental thing, rather than just a place, one that to which inhere people's lives and their social relationships. It has become something that is fungible and accounted for at national scales without regard to the local. And here I argue that studies of the construction of race as something that is a global phenomenon, or ought to be considered as a global phenomenon, points to the kind of key factor that allows us to theorize race across ethnicities or across even more homogeneous kind of ethnic populations, is the uneven exposure to death and the devaluing of people's lives as being fundamentally what we can understand as a global racial process. And in the face of climate change, in the face of climate change related disaster and vulnerability, this is beginning to be something that's widely talked about. If we think about Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico or Katrina a decade ago. But on the other hand, we also need to think about how climate adaptation and how solutions to climate change, like green industrialization, link into these processes of globalized race and unevenness in global climate injustice, in the production of refugee populations, in uneven impacts, in the different outcomes of benefits and harms that are wrought by climate change related problems themselves, but also by our solutions to them. So virtually all of China's green development zones have required extensive village displacement and forced dispossession of both land and village homes and property. In Jia-Ching and elsewhere, this has engendered small-scale resistance, what are called nail households, so-called because they're like a stubborn nail that has driven themselves in, right, and won't be pried out. People in Jia-Ching resisted village evictions and demolition notices as a point of contesting procedural processes of notification, but also the assessment of property values in relationship to rural livelihoods, to farming, but then also to people's natal birthplaces, to places that they believed were villages in this sense, right? As a place, not just as a spot of land, but as something that was the site of generations of cultural reproduction and family making, of livelihoods, of so much, right? That could not just be accounted for in a single compensation settlement as a price, as a single amount of money. And at the same time, this kind of enabling of a modular form of green industrialization that is predicated upon rural dispossession had its global, it's something that drove and was underpinned by global subsidies, right? So subsidies in the United States, but primarily in Europe, drove industrialization in China. That is to say, governments in Spain, Germany, primarily France, brought public money into commodity production and markets in China. It drove this kind of industrialization as a market opportunity. That was identified by local officials and by national officials alike. Over time, this led to what I described as a massive collapse in commodity prices, but this is actually this is market capitalization of the companies themselves. The crash in market prices for solar as a commodity thing that you install on a rooftop or in a field led to, as China's capacity to build these things led to cheaper and cheaper prices through the devaluing of rural land, of rural livelihoods, and so on, that enabled that expansion. This had global market repercussions that reverberated from the close of 2012 with massive bankruptcies, including that of the largest manufacturer in the world, which is still now unable to manufacture, but still exists as a corporate entity. That is Suntech. Here you see 5 of the largest companies in the world bottoming out in terms of market capitalization just in the matter of a few months. This led to factories around the world being closed for years. And while that market now is in recovery, we need to think about how those factories and those spaces themselves are a part of the solar resource, right? That despite our leadership in, and this is, let me be clear, I'm not saying that it's not important to support and pursue renewable energy commodities and renewable energy resourcing like solar. But what I'm saying is that the high carbon approach and the assumption that a market valuation will capture not just energy values, right, is something that can replace renewable energy values, is something that can replace fossil fuel energy value, as something that is simply, that the price mechanism itself is flawless, right? That it captures all the value that needs to be understood. The problem with that approach, of course, is that what has made Chinese solar competitive and what has made it possible to expand from, almost nothing to nearly 2% of world energy mix is, or a large, over 1% of world energy mix, that is an imaginary that is captured by this slogan in the California Go Solar program, which sought to, under state subsidies, to create 3 gigawatts of rooftop solar by the end of 2016 and allocated over $3 billion to that for a target amount of greenhouse gas mitigation. That is to say, the California program has this idea, right? that we enjoy clean solar energy where you live, where you work, wherever you are. That it's not just, that it is fundamentally this idea that you can take solar into the existing infrastructure, but then also the way that we use it and understand it, that it becomes totally transparent, right? It becomes totally embedded in what already exists, that nothing has to change. And so with that is also an idea that the solar resource is simply the sun shining, that it makes invisible these things, touted though they are here, at least where they're built, right? That there is not a connection between the actual materiality of solar and what makes it function, where it is built, who touches it, and how it comes onto rooftops, but is something that is simply a part of nature out there. And so what to make of the global politics of making renewables and the measured and kind of effective, the felt kinds of dimensions of low carbon value. In our conjuncture, globally decisive forces lie in Western liberal capitalism, which has heretofore failed to address the limitations of what I was describing before, as what Timothy Mitchell describes as carbon democracy, as a form of energy valuation, but also forms of politics, right, that depend upon fossil fuels, and that they shape both the limits of where democratization has taken place, that is to say, Western liberal democratization, and where it was explicitly repressed, and that is in oil-producing states around the world. Chinese illiberal and actually anti-liberal successes, which have also heretofore extended entanglements between high carbon and low carbon value. This is our global conjuncture, the failure of liberal Western capitalism and politics to address climate change, and the successes primarily have been created in China, but have been also of a character of quote unquote illiberal, but at the same time are also, I would argue, anti-liberal in important ways. Put another way, I argue that the global economy for low carbon value represents not a convergence around assumed economic growth as a driver and partner of democratic liberalization, but that there's a convergence around the limits of liberalism. That is a depoliticization of structural inequalities in the liberal West and in the illiberal East. That is to say that in the West, a consideration of notions of justice, of climate justice, of just transitions, of understanding these kinds of resourcing are thought of as essentially antithetical, if not, or maybe a degraded level of importance, if not actually antithetical to addressing climate change. That is to say that a human level kind of concern, and you see a lot of this in the idea that population control is the main, AOC recently talked about this, that population control is a legitimate approach to alleviating climate. This is a certain kind of making equivalent a human body with a relationship with the atmosphere. And certainly we all consume, we all do have a carbon footprint. But mistaking that fact for an idea that the mitigation of climate is simply by the elimination of human bodies is an incredibly dangerous and I would say echoing other phases of that kind of master resource mentality in history that are incredibly disturbing and problematic in a conception of new Green Deal politics. So if we have that on the liberal West side, on the illiberal East side, we have a kind of depoliticization that says that if reproduction is taken care of, if there's a place to live, if there's new social welfare programs, regardless of political agency and choice, that's okay, right? A form of depoliticization of what had heretofore been understood as Chinese state-led socialism. And so Right now, what we have then is a kind of cathexis, that is a cleaving to, a holding on to an idea of reified, that is like made into a static kind of thing, exchangeable kinds of carbon value that are compatible with capitalism, along with its forms of expertise and legal guidelines that attempt to insulate capitalist accumulation from particular risks in a given place and attempt to make it appear, I apologize, wrong page, that, that are compatible with capitalism along with its global social ecological contradictions as a primary expression of shared global atmosphere. That is, that what we have now is a kind of vision of low carbon value as being 100% compatible with the growth of capitalism, despite the recognition that global capitalism has driven climate change. And so as these kinds of landscapes proliferate, let us understand that low carbon value is highly speculative in multiple ways. One, I would argue that it is a circuit of accumulation in capitalist economies and capitalizes on a cultural dividend of value. And here we can think about kind of green conspicuous consumption that drives people's desires for quote unquote alternatives, that they be legible culturally, right? That in fact, for many years, so for instance, in green automotives, that the Prius outsold other cars because it was identifiable as a hybrid car because of its funny shape. And that we are increasing an alignment, that there's a speculation that there is an increasing alignment of economic and low carbon values, that low carbon value will represent economic growth, right? And that, that economic price captures significantly and adequately low carbon value, that it can be represented. And more importantly, as a representative of climate change mitigation, value, low carbon value is actually embedded within real relationships between energy generation and consumption and the actual atmosphere. This is a speculative fiction. This is something that is not just borne out by the numbers in terms of the description of how much energy is being produced by a solar panel versus an amount of coal that is burned. This is a story that each unit of commodity renewables generation directly reflects its relationship not just to people or the earth systems, or not at all to people in the earth systems in which we are all embedded, but to the sun, the wind, and water, to nature out there, right? That the solar panel represents a mediation of the sun itself and not of social relationships that are embedded in energy resourcing. And so this is a fiction that is also fundamentally a speculation on the future of capitalism itself. Its ability to expand and scale in a way that such low carbon value might be realized and amortized as an investment in some future where such a techno-romantic view of the world need not be questioned, right? That this idea that the sun out there is going to be captured by these technological solutions, we are now acting as if that will inevitably be the truth. And so certainly this is a kind of reflection of the critic Frederick Jameson's famous aphorism that it is, quote, easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism, end quote. That actually people can likewise only imagine averting the end of the world with capitalism as the heroic savior of its own undoing. Thank you.